Hey, everybody. So Donald Trump currently is abusing my neighbors. This week, he's made some of the most beastly public comments that he's ever made. And those comments are about the Somali community in Minnesota. And it's not okay. And I want, first of all, before I say anything else, I want every one of my Somali neighbors in St. Paul to know that I don't support the president's words against you. And I don't support his mobilization of federal agents to try to intimidate you as you go about your lives. And I'm glad that you're here. And I'm glad that for decades you've been an important part of this city. And it's not okay that Trump is using you for his own selfish political purposes. So I just had to say that to start. And now to my regular listeners, I've got some things to say about all this, but this is one of those talks that I've had to redo several times all day because the first several attempts came off, I think, so angry that I just thought people probably just aren't going to listen. They'll just tune me out. And I don't want you to tune me out because this is important stuff. My friend Steve gave me the best advice I've ever gotten about preaching early on in my pastoral career. He said, be sure that you read the Bible passage out loud because then even if your own words suck, then at least the word of God will be preached. So even though these videos aren't sermons, I'm going to do that today. Since otherwise, I think I'll just end up ranting about the guy in the Oval Office. And I actually want to be helpful. I want to contribute to the conversation instead of just kind of bleeding all over everyone. So before I share, my thoughts on Donald Trump's ignorant thoughts, I do want to share a few of God's thoughts about immigrants from the book of Leviticus. And I could have picked any number of passages because this teaching runs all through both the Old and the New Testaments. But I'll just read this one for today. When a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So let me just state the obvious here. It's not like the foreigners that God is talking about in this passage were just like the Israelites that he was speaking to. They had different customs. They ate different foods. They even worshiped different gods. But the teaching is really clear. They're to treat them as their native born. Love them as yourself, he told them. So when Trump makes these ignorant comments about how the Somalis won't assimilate to American customs, just as an excuse for heaping abuse on them, I just want to point out that for anyone who claims to have a biblical approach to life, you just don't get to mistreat someone just because they haven't fully bought into your own culture. It's never been a smooth and easy process to bring in like a sizable number of immigrants. That's always been difficult. Throughout history, demagogues have used hatred of immigrants more than probably any other issue to rally traditionally minded people around themselves against a supposed common enemy. Human beings just are tribal. We all are on some level. And there's nothing wrong with having like a special affinity for your own tribe. If you're talking about, your family, your fellow Vikings fans or whatever, that sort of those bonds of affection, those can be good. But tribalism, when we attach ourselves so strongly to our own tribes and put down the others, that's a dark part of human nature. And demagogues like Donald Trump always try to stir up that dark part of human nature. But the gospel of Jesus annihilates tribalism. So no one who claims to be a follower of Jesus ought to have anything to do with Donald Trump at this point. And Christians across America, and in Minnesota specifically right now, Christians just have to stand up and be counted in our opposition to Donald Trump's cruel agenda against the Somalis in our state. I was going to play some of Trump's comments at the end of this video, but I just don't feel like it today. But it is important to keep a record of what he's saying. And someday it'll be important to play those words again for our friends and our loved ones who are sitting silently by right now while he says these things, because someday they're going to deny that they supported him, or at least they're going to deny that he was all that bad. And I'm just not going to tolerate that. Anyone in Minnesota who's silent right now is complicit with Donald Trump's dehumanization and demonization of our neighbors. And it's all happening right out in the open. There's no excuse for anyone who claims to be a Christian to support what's happening. And it's not only words. He's mobilizing federal agents to come into our state to harass Somalis. We're already hearing reports of dozens of Somali citizens who are being stopped and asked for their identification. And once again, for like the 432nd time, he's proving that his mistreatment of immigrants goes far beyond just the undocumented ones. You know, for many years, whenever I've talked about Trump's abuse of migrants, I'll get half a dozen of the same people, mostly, commenting on my videos, telling me that Trump is only abusing illegal immigrants. And I've always had the same three responses to that. The first response just happens inside my head, and I try to never actually say that response out loud. But then my second response is always, well, even if they were all undocumented, which they're not, what kind of twisted morality are we operating under if we think being undocumented ought to open any human being up to abuse? And then my third response is just, it's never been just about undocumented immigrants. You know, they're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats. That was about legal Haitian immigrants. And for many years, I've talked specifically about Trump's treatment of Somalis in Minnesota. I wrote in my book last year about how in every one of his campaigns, he flew into small towns in rural Minnesota, the towns where a lot of our Somali neighbors have gone to find work. And of course, that creates difficulty in a town. The town that I grew up in, Mankato, when I was there in the early 80s, in my school, Mankato East High School, we had one black kid in the school, and his dad was a professor at Mankato State University. Now they have all kinds of Somalis, you know, so that is obviously a difference, and it's going to create tensions, and it's going to be difficult at first to learn how to welcome a bunch of new people with different customs, who eat different foods, who worship a different God. And in the small towns, I think it's harder for them to do it than it is in St. Paul and Minneapolis. And so Trump flew into those towns, and he railed against refugees, you know, Somali refugees. And so here's an interesting thing that I didn't even know this until like today, that well over 90% of the Somalis in Minnesota, I've been referring to them as refugees, and many of them came here as refugees, but well over 90% of them are actually citizens. And most of the rest of them are on their way to becoming citizens. And like 56%, I think, are born here, you know, so it's a very young population. And the numbers that I've seen suggest that less than 1% are undocumented. So Donald Trump is mobilizing federal agents against a problem that does not exist. Now, he has thrown out warnings about denaturalizing people. I mean, what's that going to do to a Somali who's gone through all of the process of years to become a naturalized citizen and then to be threatened with denaturalization? Like, just throwing that kind of stuff out, it's just cruel. And Donald Trump is stirring up a trouble in the Twin Cities that no one here is asking for. And I take it kind of personally, because I did ministry in the Twin Cities for 20 years. And as a Christian, I've been part of trying to create a welcoming environment for all of our immigrants. This book here on my shelf, that's always there. The reason it's there is because this is a book called, you can see it, it's called Frogtown, and it's by the photographer Wing Young Hui. And this is the neighborhood, you know, that where Jane and I planted our church in St. Paul. And it's beautiful photos of just a cross section of people who live in this neighborhood. And this neighborhood is, you know, it's made up of right now over 40% Hmong, people who came as refugees right after the Vietnam War, but it started with German immigrants in the 1800s. And then the Hmong refugees came after the Vietnam War. So they've been here a lot longer than the Somali refugees. They were seeking shelter because they sided with the United States in the Vietnam War. And I'm proud that Suni Lee is from St. Paul. She was the first Hmong American Olympic gold medalist. And just a few weeks ago, we elected Kali Her as the first Hmong American mayor of St. Paul. And she came here as a refugee from Laos. And now she's mayor-elect of the city that I live in. And you know what? No one's rioting about that. I didn't hear anyone complain about the fact that she's Hmong. It's like, oh, I guess, okay, she's Hmong. She was just another candidate, someone that you could agree with or disagree with on her policies. But St. Paul and Minneapolis have welcomed refugees for so long. It's just not a big deal. It's something that we pride ourselves on. It's something that's beautiful about our city. And of course, though, it's not an easy process, but it's worth it. And I just have to throw this in, by the way, even though it doesn't matter for the moral case that I'm making for, you should treat immigrants well, if you're worried about the United States losing out someday economically, like to China, what's the biggest advantage the United States has, or at least that we used to have? It's our demographics. China's economy is going to struggle in the coming decades because of an aging population. And until we elected Donald Trump again, the U.S. was in a clearly better position demographically because we welcome immigrants and they wanted to come here. Immigration has been one of our superpowers, and it keeps our population young. But Trump and J.D. Vance and Stephen Miller and the rest are stifling that advantage because they're playing to the worst elements of our country. They're playing to the people who fear what they call the browning of America. That's all that this is about. It's not about the long-term health of our nation. We don't have serious problems in St. Paul and Minneapolis with our immigrants. It's a beautiful part of our country, of our city. And Donald Trump talks about, I heard him talking about Somali gangs. And yeah, I'm sure Somali gangs exist. I know that Hmong gangs exist. I know that there are probably gangs with white kids in them too. But not once in my existence as a St. Paulite for decades have I gone outside and thought anything about a Somali gang. It's not something I've ever thought about. But he makes it sound like they're running all over the city. It's insane. So Donald Trump is causing these problems in our city and in our country by demonizing immigrants just so that he can win over the bigot vote, so that he and his buddies can seize as much short-term power as possible using the petty hatreds and the bigotries of Americans. Their long-term plan isn't for the success of America. Their long-term plan is to live off the wealth that they're accumulating now while they distract Americans from their corruption by getting us to fight among ourselves. And nothing divides a nation like pitting people against a chosen other. And that's all that this is about. Trump said that Somalis are stealing billions from our state every year, and that's just absolute nonsense. And Minnesota has one of the strongest economies in the country for a state our size. And sure, we're spending a lot of money on services. That's something about Minnesota. I don't mind it. Some people do mind it. Even as a conservative, back when I was voting as a Republican and everything, I wasn't all hung up on the fact that we pay taxes. We get good services too. We have that kind of state. Fine, states can make different decisions about that sort of thing. But a portion of those services go to immigrants. But long term, those are the very people who are going to help us keep a strong economy as they continue to put down roots and get established here. And now one of the talking points is about this massive fraud that took place here involving some Somalis. I think now they've got total like 70 people who've been indicted, and I think maybe 50 already have been convicted of this massive fraud that you might have heard about. And a lot of Somalis participated in that. A lot, meaning maybe up to 50 or whatever, 70, however many, but that's a very small drop in the bucket compared to the Somali population here. But what it was a big scheme to rip off COVID relief funds that were intended to feed children across our state. But Donald Trump and his family are currently involved in shady dealings involving billions of dollars, not millions of dollars. And Trump himself has felony fraud convictions as well as civil judgments against him. But I don't rail against every heavy-set old white man from Queens because of Trump's behavior. I don't do that because it would be wrong, because it's wrong to rail against an entire group based on the actions of a few. That's called assigning collective guilt. And that's the sort of thing that demagogues do. But that's sub-Christian. And it's inexcusable to play along with that sort of thing. And it's inexcusable for Christians not to speak out loudly against it. And by the way, for what it's worth, the woman who was at the center of that big fraud, the head of it, the one that all the Republicans are using to assign collective guilt to all the Somalis in Minnesota, yeah, you guessed it. She's a white woman. She organized the whole thing, and she recruited the Somalis who helped her, and she's going to be sentenced soon. But I'm married to a white woman, so I guess I'm not going to be assigning collective guilt to all white women either. So I want to share a couple of quick stories. So if you do hear Trump's vile words later, you can think about the human beings that he's demonizing. The first story is about a friend of mine who coached a high school basketball team years ago in a Twin Cities church league. And the team that he coached was a bunch of young Somali guys. But the league made a rule that the kids had to attend Bible studies each week if they wanted to participate in the league. And that was a problem since these kids are Muslim. But they worked out an agreement with the league. The kids agreed to do a Bible study every other week. And on the off weeks, my friend and his partner, who were both like Christian leaders, would sit with the kids and learn from one of their religious leaders. So they're modeling learning from each other. And I'm not going to pretend that it was always easy to work through their differences. And I don't know if anyone convinced anyone of anything, but I can guarantee that everyone involved in that was changed for the better. And I thought it was beautiful. And then this other story was just a few days ago. A friend of mine who lives with us took an Uber back to our house. And I went out to fetch her bags, and I had just a brief conversation with this delightful young Somali woman who drove her home. And I'm not going to pretend to be especially involved with the Somali community here, but I do interact almost every day just because we have, like 80,000 Somalis in Minnesota, close to 60,000 in the Twin Cities. And so they're just part of our community. So I interact with them every day. And like in this case, I interacted, with somebody who was driving an Uber. And that young woman told my friend that she's got 2 kids. She lives with her mom, and she's going to school while holding down a couple of different jobs. And so she's working all the time. And she's building a better life for her kids. And that's just the immigrant story. That's always been the immigrant story. So when you hear Donald Trump talking about Somalis, I hope that you think about these people that I've mentioned. And I just want to say this last thing. And this is hard. I can't imagine a refugee community that's experienced more trauma than our Somali community in Minnesota. I mean, can you imagine? If you know the history, can you imagine? And what does it do to them to have the President of the United States demonize them now as they're trying to build a life for themselves? As I said earlier, we're already hearing about dozens of Somali citizens being stopped by federal agents and asked for identification. Donald Trump and J.D. Vance and Kristi Noem and all the other sociopaths in this administration are intentionally traumatizing an entire group of people who've already been traumatized beyond what any human being should suffer. And they're doing it for no good reason. They're doing it to score political points with the worst people in America and to coarsen the rest of us so that we just start to accept it. And I don't accept it. And I don't accept the lying and the demonizing words that Donald Trump uses. I don't accept these words from the meanest and spiritually ugliest man to ever hold the office of President of the United States. So thanks for listening.